Netanyahu has long seen Iran, particularly nuclear Iran, as an existential threat. Now, the irony is you and I might be having a discussion in 5 years after Iran successfully tests its first nuclear weapon, in which this will turn out to be Netanyahu's greatest failure because it was the bombing of Iran that convinced the Iranians to finally go ahead and build a weapon. So it may turn out that years from now, with the benefit of hindsight, we see that the Israeli attack actually propelled the Iranians into doing something they weren't otherwise going to do, which is actually build a bomb.
The summer of 2025 will be remembered as a time of transformation in the Middle East. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a surprise attack on military and nuclear facilities in Iran. Israel claimed the so-called preemptive strikes were meant to prevent Iran from building a nuclear bomb. In the ensuing 12-day war, Israeli strikes killed over 900 Iranians. Iran's retaliatory attacks killed 28 Israelis. A week and a half later, the U.S. joined Israel's campaign and bombed Iranian nuclear plants. The next day, U.S. President Trump announced that Israel and Iran had come to an agreement on a ceasefire, which took effect on June 24th. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. In addition to the 12-day war, the chaotic political situation in Syria and the ongoing genocide in Gaza are altering the political landscape in the region. Since mid-July, in the southern Syrian city of Suwaida, clashes between Druze groups and Bedouin tribes have displaced 175,000 people and caused over 1,000 deaths. On July 16th, Israel bombed the Syrian Defense Ministry in central Damascus, along with other military sites in the capital and targets in southern Syria, claiming to protect minority Druze communities and sending a warning message to the new Syrian president Ahmed al-Sharaa. In the occupied Palestinian territories, every day seems to bring more stories of horror and devastation. Since October 7, 2023, when a Hamas-led attack killed 1,200 Israelis, including 600 civilians and 39 children, Israel has killed 60,000 Palestinians, including over 18,000 children, according to the UN, displaced millions, and leveled much of Gaza. The UN reports that Israeli forces have killed 1,000 desperate Palestinians seeking aid since May 2025. For the first time, two Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, have officially declared that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. This follows an earlier determination in December 2024 by the respected international human rights organization Amnesty International that Israel was committing genocide in real time. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, a global hunger monitoring system, states in a new report that the worst-case scenario of famine is unfolding in Gaza. The IPC has confirmed that at least 122 Palestinians, including 83 children, have died of starvation. Even U.S. President Donald Trump, whose government continues to provide Israel with both moral and material support in the form of billions of dollars worth of weapons, is acknowledging that starvation is occurring in Gaza. To help us unpack recent developments in what has been a tumultuous time is Rex Brynen. For over 3 decades, he's been a renowned scholar and one of the most astute and informed observers of the Middle East. Full disclosure, he was one of my professors in my first year of university. He remains a professor at Montreal's McGill University. Professor Brynen, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here.
Professor Brynen, U.S. President Donald Trump had pledged to not get the United States entangled in wars in the Middle East, and yet on June 22nd, as part of an operation named Midnight Hammer, he did just that and joined Israel's bombing campaign against Iran. We know that U.S. B-2 stealth bombers struck 3 major nuclear sites in Iran, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, dropping 14 massive ordnance penetrator bombs or bunker-busting bombs on the sites. Trump claimed that the facilities targeted by the U.S. bombers were obliterated. But the question I had for you is, why did President Trump make the decision to directly join the fray and bomb Iran?
I think there are several reasons. There are lots of people in his administration who had long been Iran hawks and had wanted the U.S. to either attack Iran's nuclear capabilities or to support an Israeli attack or some combination of this. And this, of course, was supporting what was largely an Israeli attack against other Iranian facilities. There'd been a lot of pressure from the Netanyahu government to do that. And I also think that militarily, the Israeli campaign was going quite well. And Trump wanted to jump on the bandwagon of that. It looked like it could be relatively low cost, relatively little risk to U.S. forces. Had the Israeli campaign not been going very well, we might not have seen American engagement, but it was.
Was there any kind of long-term objective, do you think, or was this just about getting a quick win for Trump?
It looks like a quick win. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons, but of course, Iran was not in the process of developing nuclear weapons, although it had been in the process of positioning itself that it could in future decide to develop nuclear weapons.
Although the Israelis say they were getting close. The Israelis say they were potentially weeks away from actually being able to build a bomb.
Yes, but the Israelis have been saying that for more than a decade, that the Iranians were getting close. I think the consensus in Western intelligence communities was the Iranians hadn't actually decided to build a bomb, but the Iranians wanted to have the capacity to decide to build a bomb in future. There are a lot of other countries that have been in that position at one point or another, including South Korea kind of is, Japan kind of is, Sweden once had that quiet policy of if we had to, we could. I think that's where the Iranians were. I think the real question now is whether the Israeli and American military actions end up putting an end to any future Iranian nuclear ambitions, or whether the Iranians decide no one would have attacked us if we'd had a bomb, so maybe we should build one after all. And of course, we're only in this position because the first Trump administration abandoned the nuclear deal that had been signed with Iran, in which the Iranians had committed not to build a bomb. So to some extent, the Trump administration was trying to solve a problem that was of its own making.
What is the consequence, or what has been the consequence of this action taken by the United States?
Well, there was always a fairly heated Iranian national security debate between hawks who thought that a nuclear capability was a good thing and others who worried that it just made Iran vulnerable to precisely this kind of attack. And we don't really have any visibility in the public domain as to how that debate is going. But I imagine there's right now a debate in Iran between let's not go back there, we'll just get bombed again, versus we need to go there because if we did have a nuclear weapon, people wouldn't risk bombing us. More broadly, there's going to be a lot of introspection in Iran about why all of their strategic deterrence failed. Their long-range missile capability was not enough to deter Israeli actions. Of course, Hezbollah had been previously grievously damaged during the Israeli campaign in Lebanon. So I think the Iranians in the national security establishment are going to have to do a lot of thinking about how their assumptions about deterrence and regional influence haven't worked out very well for them in the last 2 years.
It would seem as if Iran has been exposed as a proverbial paper tiger.
Well, I wouldn't say it's quite a paper tiger because it still has the ability to influence things. The Iranian-backed militias are still an important component in Iraqi politics. The Houthis continue to attack shipping in the Red Sea, in part because of Iranian technical assistance. But it certainly turned out that their air defenses, their missile deterrent, and Hezbollah were not enough to prevent the Israelis from doing what they did. And of course, the Israelis have kind of picked one target at a time. They went after Hamas, then they devoted their attentions to Lebanon. Of course, the Syrian regime was overthrown, which was an Iranian ally, and hurt Iran too. Then they went after Iran.
And made it easier for Israel to penetrate Iran's defenses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they could fly over Syria. Syria's air defenses were in shambles anyway, but Israel bombed remaining Syrian military capabilities after the collapse of the Assad regime to make it easier to do so. So they no longer had that problem of which country do we overfly and will they like it and will they let us, since it was relatively easy to fly over Syria. And Iraq doesn't have any meaningful air defenses, so you have a fairly straight route in.
So what does this conflict tell us about the state of the Iranian regime? What is the state that it's in right now?
So, it's an interesting question. It's really going to work itself out over months and years about what this does to Iranian internal politics. There were those who said, if Israel goes after the Iranian regime will crumble. That hasn't happened. I think there are a lot of Iranians who are angry at the amount of money that Iran spends on foreign adventures, military capability, regional influence. But also, Iran's a very nationalistic country, and there are lots of Iranians who didn't like getting bombed by Israel and probably would like to be more ready the next time. So I don't think we entirely know how that's all going to work out. Most of the Israeli targeting was on military facilities or things related to the nuclear program. There wasn't widespread destruction of Iran's oil exporting capability, so its economy was in no way crippled. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that Iran will continue to kind of fumble through domestically the way that it has. The regime will be unpopular, but there won't be a big enough threat to the regime to overthrow it. But, sometimes these things are hard to predict. But I don't see at this point any evidence that that war caused the regime to become so fundamentally weak that it's threatened.
What does this, I guess they're calling it the 12-day war, what does it represent for Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, it was a major military and foreign policy success. It continues to distract from his abject failure in Gaza, his, responsibility for lax security and propping up Hamas that led to the October 7th attacks, and his really inability to defeat Hamas in Gaza. So it was a useful distraction. It caused him to draw closer to President Trump. There's very little daylight between them now, but there was a time when there was actually quite a bit of tension between Trump and Netanyahu in the past. So foreign policy success, not only in terms of dramatically diminishing Iranian influence and capabilities, but also in terms of growing closer to the U.S. and distracting from his corruption trial, his domestic political woes, and so forth. So I think it was a major success for Netanyahu.
And really one of the major achievements of his political career. This is something that he has been aiming for decades. He has wanted to, attempt to decapitate the Iranian regime, or certainly to pull the United States into direct conflict with Iran for a very long time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Netanyahu has long seen Iran, particularly nuclear Iran, as an existential threat. Now, the irony is you and I might be having a discussion in 5 years after Iran successfully tests its first nuclear weapon, in which this will turn out to be Netanyahu's greatest failure because it was the bombing of Iran that convinced the Iranians to finally go ahead and build a weapon. And for all the destruction of facilities, it is hard to prevent the Iranians from ever doing it because nuclear weapons are 1940s technology. So it may turn out that years from now, with the benefit of hindsight, we see that the Israeli attack actually propelled the Iranians into doing something they weren't otherwise going to do, which is actually build a bomb.
Can you explain to us the origins of the conflict between Israel and Iran? Like, where does it come from? Because there was a time when the two countries were actually allies.
Well, certainly the Israelis had good relations with the Shah of Iran. And of course, the Shah of Iran was seen in Iran as a brutal dictator, hence his overthrow. So that's part of the tension. The Iranian regime has as its ideological base an Islamism, a particular worldview that views Israel as an enemy, views Zionism as wrong, supports the Palestinian cause. There's geopolitical aspects, too, in that Iran extended its influence by supporting Hezbollah, by supporting Hamas, and so on and so forth. Both of them see themselves as regional great powers. Israel sees itself as the most powerful country in the Middle East, which it undoubtedly is right now. Iran sees itself as historically one of the leading actors in the Middle East and particularly the Gulf region. So there's that kind of collision, too, between two kind of would-be regional dominant powers. So there's a lot of reasons, ideological, historical, geopolitical, that have contributed to this conflict.
Has this war fundamentally changed the political dynamic in the region? We see now a weakened Iran. We know that Hezbollah has been decimated. Hamas has also been decimated. These, of course, were proxies of the Iranian government. So have things fundamentally changed? Is the political landscape very different today than it was, in October 2023?
I think it has, but I wouldn't just credit that to the Israel-Iran war. I think the wars that started on October 7th, coupled with the ending of the Syrian civil war and the establishment of a new regime there, have fundamentally changed the region. Iran is much weaker. We don't quite know what the political future of Hezbollah is in Lebanon. Hamas is grievously damaged. We have an apocalyptic situation in Gaza with starvation, with, over 2/3 of all buildings destroyed or heavily damaged, increasingly uninhabitable. Things have fundamentally changed in Syria, and Syria is unstable and could break apart at the seams or fall into renewed civil war. So it is a very different region, and Israel is feeling much less constrained. Israel's much higher propensity to use military force than it did in the past. And so that's all changed. And then, of course, add into that the Trump administration and the changes that bring to every region of the world, including the Middle East. Yeah, it's a new Middle East. What perhaps hasn't changed is I think a lot of the Arab regimes are still behaving like the same Arab regimes. So for the Gulf countries, Egypt, they're just trying to navigate all of this. I don't know if we see any fundamental change there.
You're saying that Israel is less constrained, which would suggest that Israel is in a more powerful position. Benjamin Netanyahu has been prosecuting these campaigns, ostensibly, he says, to make his country safer. But is it safer? Is Israel any less vulnerable today than it was on October 7th?
Well, I think it's less vulnerable in a purely military sense. It's perhaps more vulnerable in a longer range historical sense for several reasons. The Netanyahu government is clearly opposed to any kind of Palestinian self-determination. Its now explicit policy in Gaza is to try to force Palestinians into a humanitarian camp, effectively a concentration camp in which Palestinians can enter to get fed, but on condition they never leave unless it's to leave Gaza. That ethnic cleansing, endorsed by the United States, is now an explicit Israeli policy articulated by the defense minister, which is something that Israel would have never explicitly articulated. So clearly they feel that the region and domestic politics in Israel allow them to do something that extreme. We have what the International Court of Justice likened to an apartheid-like situation in the West Bank. We're building in even more generational conflict because the Palestinian issue is not going to disappear. Israel has the upper hand, but there will always be that opposition and resistance and what have you. And international opinion, I don't know that it's changing as we speak. France has decided it will eventually later this year recognize a Palestinian state. Maybe some other countries will join that amongst the G7. Israel's image is damaged, but it may not care too much. But I think Israel is in a historically more precarious position because it's essentially constructed a regional situation and a situation with regard to the occupied territories that it's going to be a garrison state relying on military force and occupation and repression for its national security, as opposed to finding some way of living in peace with others in the area.
I wanted to speak about Gaza and Palestine because every day in Palestine, the situation grows more dire. Every day we hear that the population is on the brink or suffering from starvation, which leads to chaotic scenes of desperate Palestinians, young and old, scrambling to get food and then being shot in the process by Israeli forces or forces associated with the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Why is it that it seems the Palestinians have no actor who can intervene and protect them?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is no doubt, as I said before, there is an engineered humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Right? Keep in mind that all of Gaza is within 45 minutes drive of unlimited food supplies, right? I mean, you could solve the problem of hunger in Gaza in 48 to 72 hours if you wanted to bring food in, if the Israelis wanted to do it properly, or if they'd let the UN and humanitarian agencies do it. However, that's not what they want to do. They are using hunger and deprivation as a form of collective punishment. They're using it as a way to try and drive the population out of Gaza. Their explicit Israeli plan now is that if you're hungry, go south. We'll set up a humanitarian camp. Once you enter, you are not allowed to leave. So it's a proper concentration camp in the original pre-World War II sense of the word. And the only place you can ever go is leave Gaza. That's explicitly the plan. And so the hunger that we're seeing is not a mistake in that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is just not very good at its job. Everyone said that model was going to be a failure. We now have all the UN agencies. We have over 100 NGOs saying this is deliberate and the hunger is getting worse and worse. This is not South Sudan. This is not Darfur. This is not North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is not a place that it is hard to get to. There is, Israel has essentially unlimited amount of food. There'd be no problem feeding the population of Gaza if you wanted them to eat.
And yet, Professor Brynen, the Israelis, officials in the Israeli state would say, Rex Brynen, this is nonsense what you're saying, and you are biased. The fact is that Israel has provided food, there are trucks waiting to help Palestinians. The problem is the UN. The problem has always been the UN. The UN is throttling the passage, the delivery of these foodstuffs to the Palestinian people.
Well, we know that's not true because when we did have a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, the UN was able to deliver food and hunger stopped. And they were able to do it very, very quickly. Absolutely, there are some trucks that are stuck at border crossings and not able to cross, but that tends to be because the Israelis won't do the deconfliction. They won't guarantee that they won't get shot at. They won't allow them to go certain places via certain routes. They won't allow their drivers to drive. That tends to be the problem. Or that they'll shoot on crowds, so it's not safe. World Food Program was complaining about this. Cindy McCain, who can hardly be thought of as a leftist radical, was complaining that the crowds that were forming around their trucks were being shot at by the IDF. So that is simply an excuse. And of course, every regime that's ever conducted war crimes has accused its critics of being biased. I mean, that's simply the norm. But in this case, we have, well, first, an international criminal court has indicted the Israeli prime minister for crimes against humanity. I think we're probably past the crimes against humanity and into the genocide terrain now in terms of what is happening. We have all the UN agencies. We have all the NGOs, MSF, Save the Children, Oxfam, all saying the same thing. We have the media reporting it. We even have parts of the Israeli media reporting it. So I don't really think there's any doubt about what is happening. But to get back to the earlier part of your question, the Western world seems unable to do anything about it. And I think there are several reasons for that. One is a reluctance to criticize Israel that's baked into foreign policy and domestic politics. Part of it is the Europeans being preoccupied with the major war that they have on their frontier in Ukraine, and the Middle East just being less of a priority. Partly, it's also the failure of Arab regimes to do very much, the Gulf states, Egypt. And of course, we have a U.S. administration that doesn't care, to the point that technically it's still the official policy of the U.S., although they keep walking back from it and then going forward to it again, that President Trump explicitly said we should depopulate Gaza so we can use it for real estate development. So, the official policy of the United States is it's okay to forcibly displace 2.2 million people if that's what Israel wants to do. And of course, the Israelis were smart enough to seize upon that and now frame their current policies as implementation of the Trump plan. But the U.S. isn't going to do anything. Donald Trump does not care about human rights anywhere in the world. The Europeans are preoccupied. The global South doesn't have the muscle. The Russians don't count. The Chinese don't count. The Arab states aren't doing very much.
And yet commentators like Bret Stephens in the New York Times have been saying that this allegation against Israel, that they are committing war crimes, that they are committing genocide, is effectively a blood libel, that in fact, this is a war. This is a war, and war is hell. It's unfortunate that Palestinian civilians are caught in the middle of all of this, but Israel does not have the intention to do away with the Palestinian people, to wipe out the Palestinian people, that this is just part of prosecuting a war intended to make Israel stronger and defend itself from existential threats.
Well, we see some excellent reporting in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, on the demolition campaign of buildings, of destroying Gaza, which makes it clear that the purpose isn't just tactical military necessity, which is the requirement under international law. It's blowing up buildings so people can't live there. The explicit policy of the Israeli government is to force people to move south and then ultimately try and find some country that will take them, which is ethnic cleansing. That's explicit. It's not me saying that. It's the Israeli defense minister saying that. And the government of Israel say that that's the Trump plan, because that kind of was the Trump plan. The getting food there is no difficulty getting food into Gaza. It's hard to believe that a country that can mount a sophisticated operation at long distance against Iran can't get flour into the Gaza Strip. So I think the evidence is overwhelming. In every war, there are partisans who view the entire war through the lens of their political preference, which is what I think you see there. But if you look at all the humanitarian agencies, if you look at most genocide scholars, if you look at most scholars of the Middle East, I think it's pretty clear what we're seeing in Gaza is appalling and apocalyptic and not the normal conduct of warfare.
In recent weeks, we've seen fighting between the Druze minority community and Bedouins in the southern city of Ceuta in Syria. We've seen over 1,000 people die, many more injured. What essentially is this conflict between the Bedouins and the Druze about?
There are a variety of tensions between parts of the Druze community and parts of the Bedouin community, some of which just relate to kind of banditry and clan warfare. They don't always have a big political, ideological, sectarian reason. There are also major splits in the Druze community between those who want to work out a deal with the new Syrian central government and those who are looking to expand their power, possibly with the help of Israel. The Syrian security forces are not disciplined or well-trained. They're a collection of militias, some of which are fairly extremist sectarian Sunni militias. So violence rapidly escalates. You get revenge killings. And then you have regional actors, Israel in particular, kind of stirring the pot there as well, because it would rather like to see the Druze community feeling under threat and then perhaps moving closer to Israel. And in any case, wouldn't like to see the new Syrian state as particularly successful.
Benjamin Netanyahu claims to be the protector. He's declared himself and declared Israel to be the protector of the Druze across the region. And Israel made the decision to bomb the city of Ceuta, but also launch a strike on the military headquarters, Syria's military headquarters, in the capital city of Damascus. What do you make of Israel's attacks on Syria?
So I think that's an attempt to forge an alliance with the Druze and weaken the central government, or at least to forge an alliance with one part of the Druze community, because it needs to be understood that although the Druze militia commander and leader that they've aligned themselves with has been happy about that, there are many other Druze leaders who are furious about that. So it's not as if the Druze community is united in its attitude to Israeli intervention, because they certainly aren't. This is not a new policy. Israel did something similar with regard to Maronite Christians in South Lebanon from the late 1970s up until 2000. They even went to the point of arming Christian militias in South Lebanon, the so-called South Lebanese Army, some Shiites, but mainly Christians, in an attempt to find a minority that they could support as a buffer against their enemies. That did not work out very well for them at all in the end. I think that they're trying something similar with regard to Druze areas of Syria.
But what they're claiming, what the Israelis are claiming, is that they had to attack the Syrian state because the Syrian state was about to commit genocide, or was in the midst of committing genocide against the Druze minority.
Yeah, I think it was an opportunity for them to claim that. I think what was happening was a bit more complicated. Absolutely, some Syrian security forces engaged in atrocities. No doubt about it. As I said before, they're poorly disciplined. Many of them are jihadists. The Druze aren't Muslim, so they have that hostility too. But also it was a very opportunistic action by the Israelis to try and weaken the central government. From the Israeli point of view, the more at threat the Druze are in Syria, the better for Israel. So Israel has every interest in hotting up rather than calming down that conflict, because it potentially forces some Druze leaders into their arms, which is why the Druze community is divided, and some Druze leaders are condemning the Israelis at the same time that other Druze leaders have been welcoming their support.
How do you understand the relationship between Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, and Israel and the United States?
He's trying to stabilize a deeply divided country with a weak government capacity and really problematic regime security forces, which are just the patchwork of quilt of militias that won the Civil War. I think in some ways he's been quite impressive in trying to pull things together and trying to cut deals. At the other times, he's not clamped down heavily enough on excesses by the security forces, both in coastal areas of Western Syria against Alawis and now in the south against Druze. I think he has problems there. I think he's been trying to normalize relations with everyone. whether that's the Gulf states, whether that's the United States, because he recognizes the need to reconstruct the country. But, it's very hard to make transitions out of civil war. Countries often collapse back into civil war because populations are divided, they're polarized, they're suspicious, they're fearful, they're armed, the economy is in shambles, the state is in shambles, there's no rule of law, and that's the situation he's dealing with. So I think he's done some things that have been quite impressive. I think he's done some things which have been big failures. It's a bit of a mixed picture, and we will have to see where that all goes.
Do you have a sense of what ordinary Syrian people who have suffered so much over the last 15 years, what do they have to say about their new leader?
Well, I think it entirely depends which Syrian people you speak to. It depends on where in the country, it depends on social class, it depends on ethnicity and sect. It may even depend on connections. I think that Syrians were very optimistic about the regime when it came in. Some of the violence that we've seen, as I say, first in Latakia coastal areas and now in the south with regard to Druze, has left people uncomfortable. Ironically, one of the other things that's left people uncomfortable is the regime trying to reach some accommodation with former regime elements to stabilize the situation on the other end. So I think the regime is losing popular support, but it's also very difficult to deliver peace and prosperity after, more than a decade of brutal civil war.
Professor Rex Brynen, will have to end it there, but thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.